The stagecoach hit another rut in the dusty Colorado road, and Catherine Ashford felt her stomach lurch as violently as the wooden bench beneath her, wondering if perhaps dying of consumption back in Boston might have been preferable to being rattled to death on this God-forsaken journey westward. It was July 1877, and the summer heat had turned the landscape into something resembling the surface of the sun. Catherine pressed a handkerchief to her forehead, feeling the moisture there despite the bone-dry air that seemed to leach every bit of water from her body. Her traveling dress, proper and buttoned to the throat as befitted a young woman of good breeding, felt like a woolen prison. The other passengers, a mining supply merchant and his wife, had long since given up attempting conversation, each lost in their own misery as the coach climbed higher into the Rocky Mountains. Victor, Colorado, next stop. The driver called down, and Catherine felt a flutter of something in her chest that might have been hope or might have been terror. She was 22 years old, had never been farther than Newport for summer holidays, and was now traveling alone to a mining town in the middle of nowhere because a Boston doctor had told her father that the mountain air might cure what ailed her lungs. What ailed her soul was another matter entirely, but that was not something doctors could diagnose. Catherine had spent her entire life being the perfect daughter, the perfect debutante, the perfect decoration in her father's wealthy home. She had smiled at the right men, said the right things, worn the right dresses, and felt absolutely nothing inside except a growing certainty that if this was all life had to offer, she might as well stop breathing altogether. Then the coughing had started, blood on her handkerchief, and suddenly her father had been terrified of losing his only child. The doctors had recommended mountain air, dryness, a change of climate. Her father had arranged for her to stay with a distant cousin, a woman named Margaret who had married a mine owner and moved west 15 years ago. Catherine had agreed to go, not because she believed it would cure her body, but because some small part of her wondered if perhaps it might cure whatever was dying inside her that had nothing to do with her lungs. The coach crested a final rise, and Victor spread out below them like a collection of wooden blocks scattered by a child's hand. The town clung to the mountainside at over 9,000 feet, surrounded by peaks that still wore caps of snow despite the July heat. Buildings lined unpaved streets in haphazard rows, and Catherine could see the skeletal structures of mine works rising from the earth like the ribs of some great beast. Smoke rose from numerous chimneys despite the warmth, and even from this distance, she could hear the sounds of industry, of men shouting, of machinery grinding. The stagecoach rolled down the main street, and Catherine stared out the window at this alien world. Men in rough clothing walked the wooden sidewalks, their faces weathered and hard. Horses stood tied to hitching posts, their tails swishing at flies. A saloon's doors swung open, releasing a burst of piano music and male laughter. Women walked past too, but they looked different from the ladies of Boston, their dresses simpler, their movements freer, their faces touched by sun in a way that would have horrified Catherine's mother had she still been alive. The coach stopped in front of a building marked as the Wells Fargo office, and the driver climbed down to open the door. Catherine stepped out onto the street, and the altitude hit her immediately. The air was thinner here, harder to draw into her compromised lungs, and she had to pause, one gloved hand pressed to her chest, fighting for breath. "You all right there, miss?" the driver asked, looking concerned. Catherine nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She focused on breathing slowly, carefully, the way the doctors had taught her. After a moment, the panic subsided, and she was able to look around properly. Catherine Ashford. A woman was approaching, perhaps 40 years old, with auburn hair streaked with gray and a face that showed both strength and kindness. She wore a simple calico dress and practical boots, and her hands were bare of gloves despite the social impropriety. "Cousin Margaret," Catherine managed. "The same. Oh, my dear, you look exhausted. Let us get you to the house and settled. Henry," she called to a young man standing nearby, "please see that Miss Ashford's trunk is delivered to our home." Margaret took Catherine's arm with a familiarity that would have been presumptuous in Boston, but felt comforting here. She guided Catherine down the street, keeping up a steady stream of conversation that required no response, for which Catherine was grateful. "The altitude will take some getting used to," Margaret said. "You must move slowly for the first week at least, and drink water constantly. The air is so dry here, you will dehydrate faster than you can imagine. Our home is just at the edge of town, not far." "Can you manage the walk? Or should I have someone bring a wagon?" "I can walk," Catherine said, though she was not entirely certain this was true. But she had not come all this way to be carried about like an invalid, even if that was technically what she was. The house was modest by Boston standards but surprisingly comfortable, a two-story wooden structure with a wide porch and actual glass windows. Margaret led Catherine inside and up the stairs to a small bedroom that had been prepared for her. A quilt covered the iron bed and white curtains fluttered at the open window, letting in air that smelled of pine and dust and something else Catherine could not identify, something wild and free. "Rest now," Margaret said. "We will talk more at supper. There is fresh water in the pitcher, and please do not hesitate to call if you need anything." Catherine removed her traveling dress, standing in her chemise and breathing deeply of the mountain air. She could hear sounds from the street below, so different from the genteel quiet of her Boston neighborhood. Somewhere, a man was singing in Spanish. Somewhere else, hammers rang against metal. And underneath it all was a sound she gradually realized was wind, constant and powerful, sweeping down from the peaks. She lay down on the bed, intending only to rest her eyes, and fell immediately into a deep sleep. Catherine woke to darkness and the smell of cooking food. She dressed quickly, choosing a simpler day dress than she would have worn in Boston, and made her way downstairs by the light of oil lamps. Margaret was in the kitchen, and an older man with a thick beard sat at the table, reading a newspaper. "Ah, there she is," Margaret said. "Catherine, this is my husband, Thomas. Thomas, my cousin Catherine from Boston." Thomas stood and offered a brief nod. "Welcome to Victor, Miss Ashford. I hope you will find the mountain air beneficial." They sat down to a simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread, and Catherine found herself surprisingly hungry. The altitude and the travel had taken their toll, but something about the food here tasted better than anything from her father's table. Maybe it was hunger, or maybe it was something else. "We thought you might want to rest tomorrow as well," Margaret said. "But the day after, if you are feeling well enough, I could show you around town. Victor is not Boston, obviously, but it has its own charms." "I would like that," Catherine said, and meant it. The next day passed in a haze of rest and adjustment. Catherine sat on the porch, wrapped in a shawl despite the July warmth, watching the town go about its business. Men walked past on their way to and from the mines, their faces tired but determined. Children played in the street, their laughter high and bright. And always there was that wind, carrying with it the scent of pine and rock and possibility. On her third day in Victor, Catherine felt strong enough to venture out. Margaret took her arm and they walked slowly down the main street. Margaret pointed out the various establishments. The general store, the assay office, the newspaper office, the school, the church. There were more saloons than Catherine would have expected, but Margaret explained that the miners needed somewhere to spend their wages, and the town needed the tax revenue. They were standing outside the general store, Margaret debating whether they needed more flour, when Catherine heard a commotion down the street. A horse was bucking and rearing, clearly spooked by something, and a crowd had gathered at a safe distance to watch. The animal was magnificent, a dappled gray stallion with wild eyes and flaring nostrils, and it was making a determined effort to throw off the man who was attempting to calm it. "That will be Owen Finch," Margaret said, shaking her head. "Best horseman in the county and stubborn as they come." Catherine found herself drawn toward the scene, moving closer despite Margaret's cautioning hand on her arm. The man on the horse was tall and lean, wearing worn denim trousers and a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms. A hat shaded his face, but Catherine could see the determined set of his jaw as he spoke in low, steady tones to the frightened animal. "Easy now," he was saying, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Nobody is going to hurt you. Easy." The horse reared again, and for a moment Catherine was certain the man would be thrown and trampled. But he stayed in the saddle with an ease that looked almost lazy, his body moving with the horse rather than fighting against it. He kept talking, kept that same calm, steady tone, and gradually, incredibly, the horse began to settle. It took perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt longer, but eventually the stallion stood still, sides heaving, while the man ran one hand along its neck in a long, soothing stroke. "There now," the man said. "That was not so bad, was it?" He dismounted in one fluid motion and led the horse toward a water trough. As he passed close to where Catherine stood, he glanced up and their eyes met. His were a startling green, bright against sun-darkened skin, and something in them made Catherine's breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with her damaged lungs. "Morning, Mrs. Wallace," he said to Margaret, touching the brim of his hat. His eyes flicked to Catherine. "Miss." "Owen," Margaret said warmly. "Still breaking horses for stubborn miners who think they can handle more horse than they are capable of. Someone has to do it," Owen said. There was the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth, and Catherine noticed the small lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. He was perhaps 26 or 27, she thought, though the outdoor life made it hard to tell. "This is my cousin, Catherine Ashford, recently arrived from Boston," Margaret said. "Catherine, Owen Finch. He has a ranch a few miles outside town and makes his living training horses and running cattle. He also helps out at the mine on occasion when they need an extra hand." "Boston," Owen said, and something in the way he said it made it sound like he was naming a place on the moon rather than a city in Massachusetts. "Long way from home, Miss Ashford." "Yes," Catherine said, finding her voice. "I am here for the mountain air for my health." "Well, we have plenty of that," Owen said. He touched his hat again and led the horse away, his long strides eating up the dusty street. Catherine watched him go, aware that Margaret was watching her watch him. "Owen is a good man," Margaret said carefully. "But he is not the sort your father would approve of, I am sure." "I am not here to find a husband," Catherine said, more sharply than she intended. "I am here to breathe." Margaret said nothing, but Catherine saw the small smile she tried to hide. Over the following days, Catherine found herself thinking about the cowboy more than she should. She saw him occasionally in town, always busy with some task or another, and he always nodded to her politely but never stopped to talk. She told herself she was not disappointed, that it did not matter, that she was here for her health and nothing more. But the truth was that something about the way he had handled that frightened horse, the calm sureness of his movements, the quiet confidence in his voice, had stirred something in her that she had thought was dead. She had been courted by wealthy men in Boston, men with fine manners and finer clothes, and had felt nothing. But one look from those green eyes, and suddenly she felt very much alive. Margaret was good company, showing Catherine around Victor and introducing her to the other residents. There was a small community of respectable families, people who were trying to build something permanent in this temporary place. There were also the miners, transient and rough, but often surprisingly kind. And there were the various businessmen, the shopkeepers and saloon owners and freight operators, all trying to extract wealth from the mountain. Catherine learned that Victor had only been established a few years earlier, in 1871, after gold was discovered in the area. The town was still raw and new, still figuring out what it wanted to be. Some believed it would grow into a major city, a rival to Denver. Others thought it would be a ghost town within a decade, once the gold ran out. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone was gambling their life on being right. One afternoon, perhaps 2 weeks after Catherine's arrival, Margaret suggested they take a buggy ride into the surrounding country. "The scenery is beautiful," she said, "and I thought you might enjoy seeing something beyond the town." Catherine agreed eagerly. She had been feeling stronger, her breathing a bit easier in the dry mountain air, and she was curious to see more of this strange landscape. Thomas hitched up their buggy, and Margaret drove them out of town, following a rough track that wound between pine-covered hills. They had been traveling for perhaps half an hour when one of the buggy wheels hit a rock and broke with a loud crack. The buggy lurched sideways, and Margaret fought to control the horse. They came to a stop at an awkward angle, clearly going nowhere without repairs. "Well," Margaret said, climbing down to inspect the damage, "this is unfortunate. Thomas will have to bring the spare wheel out from town." "How far back is Victor?" Catherine asked. "About 5 miles, I would estimate. I can walk back, but you should stay here with the buggy." "I can walk back with you," Catherine protested. "In this heat, at this altitude, with your lungs? Absolutely not. You stay here in the shade, and I will return with Thomas and the wheel. It should not take more than a few hours." Before Catherine could argue further, Margaret set off down the road at a brisk pace, leaving Catherine alone with the horse and the broken buggy. Catherine sat down on a fallen log near the road, pulling her bonnet lower to shade her face. The silence was immense, broken only by the wind in the pines and the occasional call of a bird she did not recognize. An hour passed, then another. The sun climbed higher, and even in the shade, Catherine felt the heat pressing down. She drank from the water flask Margaret had left with her, and tried not to worry. Surely Margaret would return soon with help. She was beginning to seriously consider trying to walk back to town herself. Bad lungs be damned, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. A rider appeared around a bend in the road, and Catherine's heart gave an unexpected jump when she recognized the dappled gray stallion and its rider. Owen Finch reined in when he saw the broken buggy. He sat for a moment, taking in the situation, then dismounted and walked over to where Catherine sat. "Afternoon, Miss Ashford," he said. "Looks like you have had some trouble." "The wheel broke," Catherine said, standing up and brushing dust from her skirts. "My cousin went back to town for help. She should return soon." Owen walked around the buggy, examining the damage. "That wheel is not going to be fixed easily. You have been waiting long, a few hours, I suppose." He looked at her more closely, and Catherine saw concern cross his face. "You are looking a bit peaked, if you do not mind me saying. When did you last drink water?" "Not long ago. I am fine." "No offense, Miss Ashford, but folks from back east always say they are fine right up until they keel over from heat or altitude or both. Come sit back down." He went to his horse and retrieved a canteen, bringing it back to Catherine. "Drink." Something in his tone brooked no argument. Catherine drank, and the water was cool and tasted faintly of metal and maybe leather, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. "More," Owen said, and she drank again. He settled down on the log beside her, keeping a respectful distance, and looked out at the mountains rising in the distance. "Your cousin should not have left you out here alone. Things can happen." "What sort of things?" Catherine asked, curious despite herself. "Weather can turn quick in the mountains. Animals. Sometimes bandits on the road, though not so much anymore. Mostly just the sun and the altitude. They will kill you as sure as anything if you are not careful." "You think I am not careful?" Catherine asked, hearing the defensive note in her own voice. Owen looked at her, and there was something like amusement in those green eyes. "I think you are a long way from home, Miss Ashford, and I think you are still figuring out what careful means out here. And you are going to teach me," Catherine said, more archly than she intended. "I am going to wait with you until your cousin returns," Owen said calmly, "and I am going to make sure you drink enough water. Beyond that, what you learn is up to you." They sat in silence for a while, and Catherine found it was not an uncomfortable silence. She studied Owen from the corner of her eye, taking in details she had missed before. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of someone who worked for his living. His clothes were clean but well worn, patched in places. He wore a gun on his hip, as most men did out here, but it looked like a tool rather than an affectation. "Why did you come to Colorado?" Catherine asked finally. Owen was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to tell her. "I grew up in Texas," he said finally, "on a ranch my father owned. When I was 18, he died, and my older brother inherited everything. He made it clear there was not room for both of us, so I headed north and west, looking for a place to start fresh." "That must have been difficult," Catherine said. "It was 8 years ago," Owen said. "I have made my own way since then. Got my own land now, small but mine. Running cattle and breaking horses, it is a good life. Do you not get lonely?" Catherine asked, then immediately wished she could take the question back. It was too personal, too revealing of her own feelings, but Owen did not seem offended. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I have always been better with horses than people. Horses do not judge you. They do not care if you have money or breeding or the right last name. They just care if you treat them well and know what you are doing." "People should be more like horses then," Catherine said. Owen laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his face. "I have thought that myself more than once, Miss Ashford." "Catherine," she said impulsively. "You can call me Catherine." "Owen," he said, touching his hat, "though you knew that already." They talked for another hour, and Catherine found herself opening up in a way she never had with the carefully vetted young men of Boston society. She told him about her illness, about the doctors and their dire predictions, about her father's desperate hope that the mountain air would cure her. She told him about feeling trapped in her old life, about the suffocating expectations and the endless rounds of meaningless social obligations. Owen listened without interrupting, and when she finally ran out of words, he nodded slowly. "The West is full of people running from something," he said. "Some are running from the law, some from debts, some from bad marriages or bad memories, and some are just running from lives that did not fit them right. Nothing wrong with that, so long as you are running toward something too, not just away." "What are you running toward?" Catherine asked. "A life that is mine," Owen said simply. "A place where what I do matters more than who my family was or was not. A place where a man or a woman, I suppose, can make something of themselves if they are willing to work for it." Catherine was about to respond when they heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Margaret and Thomas appeared around the bend, and Margaret's face flooded with relief when she saw Catherine was all right. "Thank heavens," Margaret said, climbing down. "We were so worried." "Owen, thank you for staying with her," "It was no trouble," Owen said, standing. "I will leave you to your repairs." He swung up onto his horse with that same fluid grace Catherine had noticed before. He touched his hat to the ladies, nodded to Thomas, and rode off down the mountain without looking back. "That was fortunate," Margaret said, watching Catherine's face with knowing eyes. "Owen being out here." "Yes," Catherine said, "fortunate," but she did not feel it was fortune at all. It felt like something else entirely, something she did not have a name for yet. Thomas made quick work of replacing the wheel, and they returned to town without further incident. But Catherine could not stop thinking about the conversation by the roadside, about the way Owen had listened to her, really listened, without judgment or prescription. The men in Boston had never listened. They had talked at her, about themselves and their accomplishments and their plans, but they had never asked what she wanted or cared about what she thought. Over the next few weeks, Catherine found herself watching for Owen in town. She saw him occasionally, always busy with some task, and he always nodded politely but never approached her directly. She told herself this was proper, that anything else would be inappropriate, but part of her wished he would break propriety just once. Margaret, perceptive as ever, noticed Catherine's interest. One evening over supper, she said carefully, "Owen Finch is a good man, as I mentioned before. He has a reputation for honesty and hard work. But Catherine, you must understand, your father expects you to return to Boston. He expects you to marry well, by which he means marry money and position. Owen has neither." "I do not care about money and position," Catherine said. "You say that now," Margaret said gently, "but you have always had both. You have never had to worry about where your next meal was coming from or whether you could afford a doctor if you became ill. That is what life would be like, married to a cowboy. It is a hard life, Catherine, a very hard life. Harder than dying inside a little more each day in a Boston parlor." Catherine asked. Margaret had no answer to that. August arrived, bringing afternoon thunderstorms that rolled down from the peaks with dramatic suddenness. Catherine's health had improved noticeably. She could walk farther without becoming winded, and the coughing fits that had plagued her in Boston had become less frequent. The doctors had been right about the mountain air, at least as far as her lungs were concerned, but the rest of her was struggling. She felt restless, caught between two worlds. Part of her was still the proper Boston lady her father had raised. But another part, a part that was growing stronger every day, wanted to throw off her corset and propriety both and run wild in these mountains. One Saturday afternoon, Catherine was walking back from the general store when she heard shouting from the direction of the livery stable. She hurried over and found a crowd gathered, watching as a man beat a horse with a length of wood. The animal was screaming, a horrible sound, and trying to pull away from the post where it was tied. "Someone stop him!" a woman shouted, but the men in the crowd just watched, unwilling to interfere. Catherine pushed through the crowd without thinking. "Stop that immediately!" The man turned, and Catherine saw he was drunk, his face flushed and mean. "Mind your business, lady." "That is my business," Catherine said, surprising herself with the force in her voice. "You are abusing that animal." "This is my horse, and I will do what I want with it," the man slurred. "Not in my town. You will not," said a new voice, and Catherine felt relief flood through her as Owen pushed past her to confront the drunk man. "Put down the wood and walk away, Styles." "Or what?" Styles said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Or I will take it from you and show you how it feels," Owen said quietly. There was no threat in his tone, just statement of fact, which somehow made it more intimidating. Styles looked at Owen, looked at the growing crowd, and evidently decided discretion was the better part of valor. He threw down the wood and stumbled away, cursing under his breath. Owen immediately went to the horse, running his hands over it gently, checking for injuries. "Easy now," he murmured. "You are all right. Easy." Catherine approached slowly, not wanting to spook the already frightened animal. "Will it be all right?" "Bruised, but nothing broken," Owen said. He untied the horse and led it toward the livery. "I will board it here and see if I can find out who actually owns it. Stiles was probably just hired to transport it and took out his own meanness on the animal." Catherine followed him into the stable, watching as he settled the horse in a stall with fresh water and hay. His movements were sure and gentle, and the horse responded to him, calming under his hands. "Thank you," Catherine said, "for stopping him." "You were the one who stopped him," Owen said, turning to look at her. "I just provided reinforcement. That was a brave thing you did, Miss Ashford. Foolish, maybe, but brave." "Catherine," she reminded him, "and I could not just stand there and watch." "No," Owen said, studying her face. "I suppose you could not. You are not what I expected, you know." "What did you expect?" Catherine asked. "I do not know. Someone more delicate, I suppose. More like the society ladies who come through here sometimes. The ones who look at everything with their noses in the air and cannot wait to get back to civilization." He smiled slightly. "You look at things differently, like you are actually seeing them." "Maybe I am seeing clearly for the first time," Catherine said. They stood there in the stable, dusty light filtering through the gaps in the boards, and something passed between them that was more than words. Catherine felt her heart beating faster, and it had nothing to do with damaged lungs and everything to do with the way Owen was looking at her. "I should go," Catherine said, though she did not want to. "I suppose you should," Owen said, though he did not move. Catherine left the stable and walked back to Margaret's house in a daze. Something had shifted between her and Owen. Some line had been crossed, and she knew with absolute certainty that her life was about to become much more complicated. That evening, Margaret had guests for supper, the mine owner and his wife and another couple from town. The conversation was dull, focused on politics and business and social gossip, and Catherine found her mind wandering. She kept thinking about Owen in the stable, about the gentleness in his hands as he tended the abused horse, about the way he had looked at her. "Miss Ashford, you seem distracted," the mine owner said, breaking into her thoughts. "I hope you are not unwell." "Just tired," Catherine said. "The altitude still affects me sometimes." Of course. You must take care of yourself. In fact, my wife and I are hosting a social next Saturday evening. Nothing too elaborate, just an opportunity for the respectable families of Victor to gather. We would be honored if you would attend." Catherine opened her mouth to decline, but Margaret spoke first. "How kind of you. Catherine would be delighted to attend." After the guests left, Catherine confronted her cousin. "Why did you accept on my behalf? You know I have no interest in social gatherings." "Because you need to remember who you are," Margaret said firmly. "You are Catherine Ashford of Boston, not some rough frontier woman. Your father sent you here to recover your health, not to lose your head over a cowboy." "I have not lost my head," Catherine protested, feeling her face flush. "Have you not? Catherine, I see how you look at Owen Finch, and I see how he looks at you. But there is no future in it. Even if you stayed in Colorado, even if you defied your father and threw away your inheritance, what kind of life would you have? Owen is a good man, but he is poor. He works from dawn to dusk just to keep his small ranch running. You would live in a rough cabin, cook your own meals, wash your own clothes, tend your own garden. There would be no servants, no comforts, no security. Is that really what you want?" "Yes," Catherine said, and realized as she said it that it was true. "Yes, that is exactly what I want. I want a life that is real, Margaret. I want to work and sweat and feel something. I want to matter, not just be an ornament in someone's parlor. I want to live, actually live, not just exist." Margaret's expression softened. "Oh, Catherine, I understand more than you know. Why do you think I married a mine owner and moved to Colorado? I wanted the same things you want. But I had the good fortune to want them with a man who could provide both adventure and security. Owen Finch can give you adventure, but at what cost?" Catherine had no answer to that, but she also could not dismiss the feelings that were growing stronger every day. She attended the social the following Saturday, dressed in her finest gown, and tried to be the person everyone expected her to be. But her heart was not in it, and when she finally escaped the stuffy parlor and stepped out onto the porch for air, she found Owen standing in the shadows at the edge of the property. "What are you doing here?" Catherine asked, looking around nervously to see if anyone had noticed him. "I was riding past and saw all the carriages," Owen said. "Figured there was some kind of fancy gathering. Should have known you would be here." "I did not want to come," Catherine said. "But you did anyway," Owen said. There was no judgment in his voice, just observation. "What was I supposed to do? This is who I am, Owen. This is where I come from. I cannot just pretend otherwise." "I would never ask you to," Owen said quietly. "Catherine, I need to tell you something, and then I am going to leave you alone, because it is not fair of me to complicate your life any more than I already have." "What do you need to tell me?" Catherine asked, her heart in her throat. "That you matter," Owen said simply. "Not as an ornament, not as a perfect daughter, but as yourself. As Catherine. The woman who stood up to a drunk beating a horse. The woman who asks real questions and gives real answers. The woman who looks at the mountains like she is seeing heaven. That woman matters, Catherine. And I think you know it, but maybe you need to hear someone else say it." "Owen," Catherine whispered. "I know there is no future for us," Owen continued. "I know you will go back to Boston and marry some wealthy man your father approves of, and that is probably for the best. You deserve a comfortable life, security, all the things I cannot give you. But I wanted you to know before you left that someone saw you, the real you, and she was magnificent." He turned to walk away, and Catherine felt something break inside her chest. "Wait." Owen stopped but did not turn around. "What if I do not want comfortable?" Catherine said. "What if I do not want security? What if I want to feel alive, even if it is hard, even if it is frightening? What if I want you?" Owen turned slowly. "Do you know what you are saying?" "Yes," Catherine said, and she did. She knew she was throwing away everything her father had planned for her, everything she had been raised to expect. She knew she was choosing a hard life over an easy one. But she also knew, with absolute certainty, that she would rather have 1 year of real life with Owen than 50 years of slow death in Boston. Owen crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He took her face in his hands, those work-roughened hands, and looked into her eyes. "I am going to ask you once more, Catherine Ashford. Are you certain?" "I have never been more certain of anything," Catherine said. Owen kissed her then, and it was nothing like the chaste pecks she had received from Boston suitors. It was fierce and honest and real, and Catherine felt like she was waking up from a long sleep. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the passion she had kept locked away for 22 years. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "This is not going to be easy. Your family, your cousin, everyone is going to tell you this is a mistake." "Let them," Catherine said. "Owen, I was dying in Boston. Not just from whatever is wrong with my lungs, but from the inside out. Since I came here, since I met you, I have felt more alive than I ever did back home. You showed me what living really means. Not just breathing, not just existing, but actually living. How can I go back to death after tasting life?" "You make it sound poetic," Owen said with a slight smile. "But the reality is I live in a 2-room cabin 5 miles from town. I work 18-hour days during calving season. I eat beans and bacon most nights. In winter, snow can trap you for weeks at a time. It is not romantic, Catherine. It is just hard work. Then teach me to work, Catherine said. Teach me everything. How to cook over a real fire, how to tend animals, how to survive out here. I want to learn. I want to be someone who can handle this life. Owen studied her face for a long moment, and whatever he saw there must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly. All right, but we do this properly. I will court you, real courtship, so everyone can see my intentions are honorable. And if after a few months you still feel the same way, if you have not changed your mind, then I will ask you properly to be my wife. Can you agree to that? Yes, Catherine said. And you have to tell your cousin, tonight, no secrets. Catherine's stomach dropped. She is going to be furious. Probably, Owen agreed. But better she hears it from you than finds out some other way. Owen was right, of course. Catherine returned to the social long enough to make her excuses, claiming a headache, and asked Margaret if they could leave early. In the carriage on the way home, Catherine told her cousin everything. Margaret's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, concern, and finally a kind of resigned understanding. I knew this was going to happen, she said, from the moment I saw you watching him with that horse. But Catherine, I must write to your father. You understand that, do you not? He sent you to me in trust, and he deserves to know what is happening. I understand, Catherine said. I will write to him as well, but Margaret, I am not going to change my mind. I know you think I will, but I will not. We shall see, Margaret said, but her voice was not unkind. The next few months were the happiest and most challenging of Catherine's life. Owen courted her openly, riding into town twice a week to take her on carefully chaperoned outings. They went on picnics in the mountains, took long walks around Victor, sat together at church services. Owen was always perfectly proper, never giving anyone cause for scandal, but Catherine could feel the desire between them like a living thing, growing stronger every time they were together. Owen also began teaching her the practical skills she would need. Margaret, surprisingly, helped with this, perhaps deciding that if Catherine was going to be foolish, she might as well be competently foolish. Catherine learned to cook simple meals, to churn butter, to preserve vegetables. She learned to ride a horse, not side saddle in a fancy habit, but astride in split skirts that would have scandalized Boston. She learned to shoot a rifle, to mend clothes, to identify edible plants. The physical work was hard, harder than anything Catherine had ever done, but she loved it. She loved the ache in her muscles at the end of the day, the calluses forming on her palms, the way her body grew stronger and healthier. Her cough disappeared entirely, and the doctor's dire predictions proved wrong. The mountain air was healing her, but so was the work, the sense of purpose, the feeling of becoming someone useful rather than ornamental. Letters arrived from Boston. Catherine's father was, predictably, horrified. He wrote demanding that she return home immediately, threatening to disinherit her, pleading with her to remember her duty to family and society. Catherine wrote back explaining her decision as clearly as she could, but she knew he would never understand. How could he? He had always been wealthy, always been powerful. He had never felt trapped by his life, because his life gave him everything he wanted. In October, Owen took Catherine to see his ranch for the first time. It was a long ride from Victor, up into the mountains where the aspen trees were turning gold and the air had a sharp bite that promised winter. The cabin was indeed small, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney, 2 rooms and a loft. But it sat in a small valley surrounded by pine-covered slopes, with a stream running clear and cold nearby, and Catherine thought it was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. It is not much, Owen said, sounding uncertain for the first time since she had met him. "It is perfect," Catherine said, and meant it. Owen showed her around the property. He had about 30 head of cattle, a small herd by ranching standards but enough to provide income if he was careful. He had a good horse barn, better than the cabin in many ways, with stalls for 8 horses. He had a vegetable garden, now mostly harvested for winter, and a chicken coop and a small smokehouse. "I built most of it myself," Owen said. "Spent the last 8 years working every daylight hour to make this place into something. It is not finished, not by a long shot, but it is mine, you know. Every board, every nail, every fence post. I can look at it and say I built that, and no one can take that away from me." Catherine heard the pride in his voice and understood it in a way she never would have understood 6 months ago. This was what real wealth looked like. Not money in a bank, but something built with your own hands, something you could stand on and be proud of. They sat together on the cabin's small porch, looking out at the mountains, and Owen said quietly, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it. Winter up here is hard. I mean hard in ways you cannot imagine yet. The snow comes in November and does not leave until April. Sometimes it is 10, 15 feet deep. You can be trapped in this cabin for weeks at a time. The wind comes screaming down from the peaks so loud you cannot hear yourself think. The cold is like nothing Boston ever prepared you for. People die up here, Catherine. Not often, but it happens. Freeze to death, or starve, or go crazy from the isolation. I can keep you safe, I believe I can, but you need to know what you are signing up for." "I know," Catherine said, though she suspected she did not really know, not yet. "And there is something else," Owen said. "Childbirth out here so far from town with no real doctor. Women die in childbirth everywhere, I know that. But out here it is more dangerous. If you become my wife, if we have children, there is risk. Real risk. I need you to understand that." "I understand," Catherine said. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Owen, I am not naive. I know this is going to be hard. I know there will be times when I question my decision. But I also know that I would rather have 1 year of real life with you, even a hard life, than 100 years of the life I left behind. You taught me what living really means. Not existing, not going through the motions, but actually living. Feeling things deeply, working hard, being part of something real. How can I go back to sleep after you woke me up?" Owen turned to look at her, and there was something in his eyes that made Catherine's breath catch. "I love you," he said simply. "I did not mean to, did not plan on it, but I do. I love you, Catherine Ashford." "I love you too," Catherine whispered. "So much it frightens me sometimes." Owen pulled her close, and they sat together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Catherine felt at peace in a way she never had before, and she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. In November, Owen formally asked Catherine to marry him. He did it properly, in Margaret's parlor with Margaret and Thomas present, offering a simple gold band he had saved for months to buy. Catherine said yes without hesitation, and they set a date for December, before the worst of the winter weather arrived. The wedding was small, held in Victor's church with perhaps 30 people attending. Catherine wore a simple dress of ivory wool, practical and warm, and carried a bouquet of pine branches tied with ribbon since there were no flowers at that time of year. Owen wore his best clothes, clean trousers and a pressed shirt and a vest Margaret had made for him as a wedding gift. Margaret cried, Thomas looked pleased, and the minister smiled as he pronounced them husband and wife. Catherine had invited her father, knowing he would not come but hoping nonetheless. He did not attend, and his letter arriving the week before the wedding made clear that she was no longer his daughter, no longer welcome in his home, no longer mentioned in his will. Catherine cried when she read it, grieved for the relationship that might have been, but she did not regret her choice. After the ceremony, there was a simple reception at the boarding house, with food provided by the ladies of the church and dancing to a fiddle player's music. Catherine danced with Owen, with Thomas, with several of the other men in town, and felt welcomed into the community in a way she had never felt welcomed in Boston society. These people were accepting her not because of who her father was or how much money she had, but because she was Owen's wife, because she had proven herself willing to work and learn, because she was becoming one of them. As the sun set, Owen helped Catherine into their wagon, which was loaded with supplies and wedding gifts from the townspeople. They drove out of Victor toward the ranch, toward their new life together, and Catherine felt no fear, only excitement and joy. The cabin was cold when they arrived, but Owen quickly built up the fire in the hearth while Catherine lit candles. The small space filled with warmth and flickering light, and when Owen turned to her, Catherine went into his arms willingly. Their wedding night was everything Catherine had hoped, and nothing like what the whispered conversations among Boston ladies had led her to expect. Owen was gentle and patient, teaching her the ways of physical love just as he had taught her to ride and shoot and survive. And Catherine discovered that passion was another kind of living, another way to feel fully alive and present in her own skin. Afterward, they lay together in the narrow bed, Owen's arm around her shoulders, and talked quietly about their plans for the ranch, for the future, for the life they would build together. "No regrets?" Owen asked softly. "None," Catherine said firmly. "This is where I belong, with you. I finally understand what it means to be home." Winter arrived in force the following week, and Owen had not exaggerated its harshness. Snow piled up higher than the cabin windows. Wind howled down from the peaks like a living thing. The temperature dropped so low that water froze inside the cabin if they let the fire die down. Catherine learned to keep the fire fed constantly, to measure their supplies carefully, to make everything count, because there would be no trips to town until spring. There were hard days, days when the walls seemed to close in and Catherine wondered if she had been foolish after all. Days when her hands were raw from work, when her back ached from hauling wood and water, when the cold seemed to seep into her very bones. But there were also good days, beautiful days, days when the sun shone on fresh snow and turned the world into a diamond-studded wonderland. Days when she and Owen sat by the fire and talked for hours, learning each other's thoughts and dreams. Days when they made love and afterward lay tangled together, warm and safe while the storm raged outside. Catherine learned that Owen had been right, that hard work and hardship could coexist with deep happiness. She learned that a simple meal of beans and bacon tasted better when you had cooked it yourself. She learned that sleeping in a narrow bed with the man you loved was more luxurious than sleeping alone in a Boston mansion. She learned that you could be exhausted and happy at the same time, that aching muscles and a full heart were not mutually exclusive. In January, a particularly fierce storm trapped them in the cabin for 2 solid weeks. They were running low on firewood, rationing food, and Catherine was beginning to understand Owen's warnings about people going crazy from isolation. On the 14th day, the storm finally broke, and Owen went out to dig a path to the barn and check on the animals. He came back 2 hours later, covered in snow, his face grim. "Lost 3 head of cattle," he said. "Found them frozen at the far end of the valley, and 2 of the chickens died from the cold." Catherine saw the defeat in his eyes and understood what this meant. Those 3 cattle represented a significant portion of their income for the year. The loss could mean the difference between making it and not making it. "We will be all right," she said firmly. going to him and helping him out of his frozen coat. "We still have the other cattle. We still have the horses, we have each other, we will be all right." Owen pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I am sorry," he said. "I am sorry I cannot give you an easier life." "I do not want an easier life," Catherine said fiercely. "I want this life with you. Owen, look at me." He raised his head, and she cupped his face in her hands. "You taught me what living really means. Not the easy, comfortable life I had before, but real life. Life with joy and pain and work and love all mixed together. Life where every day matters because you have to work for it. I would not trade this for anything. Do you hear me? Anything." Owen kissed her then, and it tasted of cold and snow and desperation and hope all at once. They made it through that winter, though it was close. They rationed everything carefully, stretched their supplies to the limit, and when spring finally came in April, they emerged from the cabin thinner and more weathered but still together, still strong. That first summer on the ranch taught Catherine more than all her years of Boston education. She learned to work from dawn to dusk, to push her body beyond what she thought were its limits. She learned to tend cattle, to mend fences, to doctor sick animals. She learned to recognize the signs of changing weather, to read the mountains and sky. She learned to make do with little, to repair rather than replace, to value things by their usefulness rather than their appearance. She also learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. The sickly girl who had coughed blood in Boston became a woman who could ride all day, work all night, and wake up ready to do it again. Her father would not have recognized her, and that was just fine. Owen taught her to shoot properly, and by July she could bring down a deer at 100 yards, which meant meat for the winter. She learned to dress the kill, to preserve the meat, to tan the hide for leather. Nothing was wasted because they could not afford to waste anything. In August, they made their first trip back to Victor since the spring thaw. Margaret hugged Catherine hard, studying her sun-darkened face and work-roughened hands with a mixture of concern and respect. "You look different," Margaret said. "I am different," Catherine said. "I am myself now, maybe for the first time." They stayed in town for 3 days, selling some of Owen's horses, buying supplies for the coming winter, and catching up with the community. Catherine was no longer the delicate Eastern lady but Owen Finch's wife, and people treated her accordingly, with respect earned rather than given. On their last night in town, Margaret pulled Catherine aside. "I received a letter from your father," she said carefully. "He asked me to tell you that if you come home, all is forgiven. He will welcome you back, reinstate your inheritance, help you get your marriage annulled." Catherine felt a pang at this evidence that her father still thought of her, still wanted her back, but she also knew her answer. "Tell him thank you, but no, tell him I am happy. Tell him I found something more valuable than inheritance or position. Tell him his daughter is alive, really alive, maybe for the first time." Margaret nodded, unsurprised. "I will tell him, though I doubt he will understand." "No," Catherine agreed. "He probably will not." They returned to the ranch, to their small cabin and hard work and simple life, and Catherine felt only relief to be home. The summer passed in a blur of activity, and in September, Catherine realized she had missed her monthly courses. She said nothing at first, not wanting to raise hopes prematurely, but by October it was clear. She was with child. The knowledge filled her with joy and terror in equal measure, remembering Owen's warnings about the dangers of childbirth on the frontier. She told Owen one evening by the fire, and she saw the same mixture of joy and fear cross his face. "Are you certain?" he asked. "As certain as I can be. I think the baby will come in late April or early May." Owen pulled her close, one hand resting on her still flat belly. "I will take care of you," he said. "Both of you, I promise." "I know," Catherine said, and she did. That winter was easier than the first, partly because they knew what to expect and partly because Catherine's body had adjusted to the altitude and climate. Her pregnancy progressed normally, and she continued to work as long as she was able, only slowing down in the final months as her belly grew large and unwieldy. In March, Owen made arrangements for a midwife from Victor to come stay with them when Catherine's time drew near. Mrs. Patterson was an experienced woman who had delivered hundreds of babies, and her presence eased some of Owen's worry. Catherine's labor started on a mild April evening as the snow was finally melting. It was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the next day, and there were moments when Owen feared he would lose her, lose them both. But Catherine was strong, stronger than anyone had imagined the delicate Boston girl could be. And in the late afternoon of the second day, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him James after Owen's father, and Catherine held him while Owen looked down at them both with wonder in his eyes. "We made this," Owen said softly. "We made a whole person." "We did," Catherine said, exhausted and elated and more in love than she had thought possible. James thrived, growing strong in the mountain air. He was a good baby, healthy and happy, and Catherine discovered that she loved being a mother as much as she loved being Owen's wife. The work was exhausting, caring for an infant while still managing all her other responsibilities, but she would not have changed anything. That summer, they had their first visitors from Boston. Catherine's younger brother, Samuel, appeared one July afternoon, riding up to the cabin with an expression of shock on his face as he took in the rough surroundings. "Catherine," he said, as if uncertain the woman standing before him in a simple dress with a baby on her hip could really be his sister. "Samuel," Catherine handed James to Owen and ran to embrace her brother. "I cannot believe you came all this way." "I had to see for myself," Samuel said. "Father said you had lost your mind, throwing away everything to live like a pauper in the wilderness. But Catherine, are you truly happy here?" "Happier than I ever was in Boston," Catherine said firmly. "Come, let me introduce you to my husband and son." Samuel stayed for 3 days, and Catherine watched his opinions shift as he saw her life firsthand. He saw how hard she and Owen worked, but he also saw the love between them, the deep partnership, the way they moved together like two parts of a whole. He saw baby James, healthy and thriving. He saw the land, the mountains, the vast sky, and something in him responded to it. On his last evening, Samuel took Catherine aside. "I understand now," he said. "What you found here, Father will never understand, but I do. You are more alive here than you ever were in Boston. You glow with it." "I do," Catherine said. "Samuel, tell Father I love him. Tell him I will always be his daughter. But tell him I found where I belong, and I will not apologize for that." "I will tell him," Samuel promised. He rode away the next morning, and Catherine watched him go with tears in her eyes but no regrets. She had chosen her path, and it was the right one. The years passed, marked by the turning of seasons and the growth of their family. Catherine gave birth to a daughter, Emily, when James was 2. 3 years after that, another son, Matthew, arrived. The cabin was too small for their growing family, so Owen built an addition, 2 more rooms and a proper kitchen. It was still humble by Boston standards, but to Catherine it was a palace. James grew into a sturdy boy who loved the horses as much as his father did. Emily was quieter, thoughtful, with her mother's love of the mountains. Matthew was still too young to show his personality, but he had a laugh that could light up the darkest winter day. Catherine's health remained strong. The damaged lungs that had brought her west in the first place never troubled her again. She realized that it had not been just the mountain air that had healed her, but the life itself, the purpose, the love, the feeling of being fully alive in every moment. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Owen took Catherine on a ride up to a high meadow overlooking the valley. It was July, and wildflowers carpeted the ground in explosions of purple and yellow and white. They sat together on a fallen log, looking out at the view, and Owen took her hand. "Have I ever told you," he said, "that you saved my life?" Catherine looked at him in surprise. "I think you have that backward." "No," Owen said firmly. "Before you came, I was just existing, working, surviving, getting by. I had land and cattle and horses, but I did not have a reason for any of it beyond simple stubbornness. You gave me a reason. You gave me a home, not just a place to live, but an actual home. You gave me a family. You gave me a life worth living." "Owen," Catherine said softly, "you taught me what living really means. Before I met you, I was dying, and not just from my illness. I was dying inside, suffocating under the weight of expectations and propriety and a life that was not mine. You showed me there was another way. You showed me I could be strong. You showed me that hard work and calloused hands and aching muscles could coexist with deep joy. You showed me that real wealth is not money but love and purpose, and knowing at the end of each day that what you did mattered." She gestured at the mountains, the valley, the vast sky. "You gave me all this. How can I ever thank you for that?" "By staying," Owen said. "By continuing to choose this life, choose me every day. That is all I need." "That is easy," Catherine said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Because there is nowhere else I would rather be. No life I would rather live. This is where I belong." They sat together as the sun traced its path across the sky, and Catherine thought about the frightened girl who had stepped off the stagecoach in Victor 13 years ago. That girl was gone, transformed into someone stronger, braver, more alive. Someone who could face blizzards and isolation and hard work and come out smiling. Someone who knew the value of things, who understood that the best things in life were not given but earned. The children grew, and the ranch prospered. There were still hard years, years of drought or brutal winters or cattle disease, but Catherine and Owen faced them together, and together they always found a way through. James, at 15, was already as good with horses as his father. Emily, at 13, had discovered a talent for raising chickens and selling eggs in town. Matthew, at 10, was still figuring out his place but showed signs of inheriting his mother's sharp mind and his father's stubborn determination. They were not rich, not by any measure of Catherine's Boston upbringing, but they had enough, and more importantly, they had each other. They had built something real and lasting, a life that mattered, a family that loved fiercely and worked hard and faced everything together. On a cold November evening, the whole family gathered around the fireplace in the main room of their expanded cabin. Owen was teaching Matthew to carve wood. Emily was reading aloud from a book, one of the few they owned. James was mending tack, his young hands already skilled at the work. And Catherine sat in her rocking chair, mending clothes and watching her family with a heart so full it felt like it might burst. This was the life she had chosen. This hard, beautiful, exhausting, wonderful life. And she would not change a single thing about it. "Mother," Emily said, looking up from her book, "was Boston really as grand as you have described? With mansions and carriages and servants?" "It was," Catherine said. "Do you ever miss it?" Emily asked. Catherine looked around the room at her husband and children, at the simple cabin that was more home than the Boston mansion had ever been. "No," she said honestly. "Not for a moment. Everything I need is right here." Owen caught her eye across the room and smiled, and Catherine smiled back. And in that moment, she felt what she always felt when she looked at him: gratitude and love, and the deep certainty that she had made the right choice all those years ago. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows as all years do. Catherine's father died when she was 38, and Samuel wrote to tell her she had been cut entirely from the will, everything going to him. Catherine felt sadness at her father's death, but no regret for her choices. She sent condolences and moved on with her life. Margaret passed away the following year, and Catherine wept for the cousin who had welcomed her to Colorado and, in the end, supported her choice even when she disagreed with it. Thomas sold the house in Victor and moved back east to live with his own family, and Catherine felt the loss of that connection to her old life. But new connections formed. James married a local girl, Sarah, the daughter of a rancher from the next valley over. They built their own cabin on a portion of Owen's land, and James took over more of the ranch operations as Owen's hair turned gray and his body slowed down. Catherine became a grandmother at 40, and holding her first grandchild, a boy named Owen after his grandfather, filled her with a joy she had not known was possible. Emily surprised everyone by going to Denver to study teaching, one of the first women from Victor to pursue higher education. She returned after 2 years with a certificate and opened a school in town, teaching the children of miners and ranchers and giving them opportunities their parents had never had. She married late, at 26, to a newspaper editor who respected her intelligence and independence. Matthew proved to have a gift for mechanics and engineering. He went to work for the railroad and eventually became a supervisor, responsible for keeping the mountain lines running. He married a widow with 2 children and made a home in Colorado Springs, close enough to visit but far enough to have his own life. Catherine and Owen grew old together, their bodies wearing down from years of hard work, but their love only deepening with time. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Owen took Catherine back up to that high meadow where they had sat years before. They moved more slowly now, their joints protesting the climb, but the view was just as beautiful. 30 years, Owen said, shaking his head in wonder. Seems like yesterday and also like forever. I would do it all again, Catherine said. Every hard moment, every struggle, I would choose this life, choose you every single time. Even knowing how hard it would be, Owen asked. Especially knowing how hard it would be, Catherine said. Because that is what made it real. That is what made it matter. If it had been easy, it would not have meant anything. Owen pulled her close, and they stood together looking out at the mountains, at the land they had worked and loved for 3 decades. You never did tell your father you found something more valuable than his money, Owen said. I told him, Catherine said. I am not sure he understood, but I told him. I found life, Owen. Real life. The kind where you feel every moment, where you work for everything you have, where love is not a polite arrangement but a fierce partnership. You taught me what that means. You taught me what living really means. They sat together until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Then they made their slow way back down to the ranch, to the home they had built together, to the life they had chosen. Owen passed away in his sleep on a cold January night when he was 62. Catherine woke to find him gone, and the grief was like being cut in half. For weeks, she could barely function, moving through the days in a fog of pain. James ran the ranch, and Sarah took care of the house, and Emily came home from town to sit with her mother, and Matthew rode up from Colorado Springs to make sure she was all right. I do not know how to be without him, Catherine told her children. He was part of me. He still is, Emily said gently. He always will be. Slowly, Catherine found her way back to herself. She would never stop missing Owen, never stop feeling the ache of his absence, but she also knew he would not want her to simply give up. She had told him once that he taught her what living meant, and she honored that by continuing to live. She moved into the house with James and Sarah, giving them the main cabin. She helped with the grandchildren, taught them to read and write, told them stories about their grandfather and the early days of the ranch. She went into town once a week, visited with Emily, kept up with old friends. She wrote letters to Matthew and his family, maintaining the connections that mattered. On her 70th birthday, Catherine sat on the porch of James's house, surrounded by children and grandchildren. There were 8 grandchildren now, ranging in age from 20 to 5, and 2 great-grandchildren as well. The ranch had grown and prospered, now one of the most successful in the county. James was a respected man in the community, and Emily's school had educated hundreds of children. Matthew had risen high in the railroad company, responsible for miles of track through some of the most difficult terrain in Colorado. All of this had started with a frightened girl stepping off a stagecoach in Victor, with a cowboy who showed her another way to live. Catherine thought about that girl sometimes, remembered her fear and her desperate hope and her absolute conviction that there had to be more to life than what she had known. That girl had been right. There was more, so much more. Hard work and deep love, and the fierce joy of building something with your own hands. Children and grandchildren, and a legacy that was not measured in money but in the strength of family bonds and the knowledge that you had lived fully, held nothing back, felt everything deeply. "What are you thinking about, grandmother?" one of the older grandchildren asked, sitting down beside Catherine on the porch. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Catherine said. "How blessed. I got to live exactly the life I wanted to live. I got to love exactly who I wanted to love." "Not everyone can say that. Tell us about grandfather again," the child said, "about how you met." So Catherine told the story once more, about the frightened horse and the calm cowboy, about learning to ride and shoot and survive in the mountains, about choosing a hard life over an easy one and never regretting it for a moment. She told them about the first terrible winter, about their growing family, about the years of work and struggle and triumph. And she told them what Owen had taught her, what she had spent the rest of her life teaching her own children and grandchildren. That living, really living, meant being fully present in every moment. It meant working hard for what you had. It meant loving fiercely and without reservation. It meant choosing your own path even when everyone told you that you were wrong. "Your grandfather taught me what living really means," Catherine said, and her voice was strong despite her age, clear despite the years. Not just existing, not just going through the motions, but actually living, feeling everything, the joy and the pain and the work and the love, all of it. "That is his gift to me and through me to all of you. Do not settle for less than a full life. Do not choose comfort over meaning. Live, actually live. That is what matters in the end." The sun set behind the mountains, and the family gathered for supper, and Catherine looked around at all these people who existed because she had made one brave choice on a dusty Colorado street so many years ago. This was her legacy. Not money, not position, not the life her father had wanted for her, but something infinitely more valuable. A family built on love and hard work, a life fully lived, memories that would be passed down through generations. Catherine lived to be 73, passing peacefully in her sleep on a warm June night with her family around her. They buried her next to Owen on a hillside overlooking the ranch, under a sky so blue and vast, it seemed to go on forever. The gravestone was simple, just her name and dates and one line that Emily had suggested. She lived fully and loved fiercely. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Years later, Catherine's great-great-grandchildren would visit that hillside and ask about the woman buried there. They would hear the stories, passed down through generations, about the Boston girl who came west for her health and found her life instead, about the cowboy who showed her another way, about hard winters and harder work and a love that lasted beyond death. And some of them, the ones who paid attention, would understand the real story underneath the romance. That living, really living, required courage. It required being willing to give up security for freedom, comfort for meaning, approval for authenticity. It required choosing your own path, even when everyone thought you were making a mistake. It required, in the end, being willing to risk everything for the chance at something real. Catherine Ashford Finch had taken that risk. She had stepped off a stagecoach into an unknown life and had found exactly what she was looking for. Even though she had not known she was looking for it at the time, she had found Owen. She had found the mountains. She had found herself. And she had lived, truly lived, every single day of the life she chose. That was the story. That was the legacy. And it was, in the end, more valuable than all the Boston wealth and position she had left behind, because you could not inherit a full life. You could not buy meaning or purpose or deep love. You had to choose it, work for it, fight for it, and hold on to it with everything you had. Catherine had done all of that. And in doing so, she had lived a life worth living, loved a love worth having, and left a legacy worth remembering. The mountains stood eternal above the ranch, snow-capped and beautiful, and somewhere in those mountains, if you listened carefully, you could still hear the echoes of a young woman's laughter as she learned to ride, as she discovered her own strength, as she fell in love with a cowboy who taught her what living really means. And that was the story of Catherine Ashford and Owen Finch, two people who found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together in the wild frontier of 1877 Colorado. A story of courage and love and the fierce joy of choosing your own path. A story of what it means to really live.